when we declare our support for Ukraine, yes, there is a moral component to it and a component to upholding the international order, but fundamentally, the clinching argument is that it's in our security interests because Europe will not be safe until Russia is either incapable or unwilling to pursue aggressive designs on its neighbours in the future. And the most direct path that they see to that outcome is a Russian military defeat in Ukraine. And that is why they have been saying for the past, 22 months now, that we in Europe should give everything we absolutely can to the Ukrainian armed forces in order to try and ensure that they do recover their territory, because that is in the long run the cheapest and the easiest and the least bloody way of protecting ourselves against Russia that we've got available.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hanson, and today I'm delighted to be joined by the Times correspondent Oliver Moody, who's written about a warning that the countries on NATO's eastern flank have as little as 3 years to prepare for a potential Russian attack. Oliver, thank you so much for your time. Welcome to Frontline.
Hello.
First of all, can you just give us an overview of what you set out in your article?
Absolutely. The stagnation of the war effort in Ukraine and the prospect of possibly even Russian advances in the coming year is really concentrating minds in NATO on what the next step of the game is and what might happen if the conflict in Ukraine does end up getting frozen. That in turn raises the possibility that the bulk of the Russian military that has up to now been tied down in Ukraine could be taken elsewhere. And so people are paying a lot of attention to statements from the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, who noted last May that he wanted to put more troops and more bases in Russia's Western Military District, which is just across the border from NATO's eastern flank in the Baltic region.
And so when we talk about the threat to NATO countries specifically, we're talking about the Baltic states.
Well, Shoigu actually made that point in connection with Finland and Sweden applying for NATO membership. And it's important to bear in mind that one of the consequences of Finland's accession to NATO in April is that NATO now has an additional 850-mile long land border with Russia. It's trebled the length of its potential contact line with the Russian military. That said, if you talk to various generals or military analysts in Europe, the default assumption is that if there were to be an attack, it would most likely hit either the Baltic states or Poland.
And in terms of where this warning is coming from, it's not just idle speculation. There's a warning specifically from the Polish security agency, and you also talk in your piece about a warning from a German think tank.
Yeah, I mean, these warnings have been around since the start of the conflict in Ukraine, and various intelligence assessments have suggested that from the moment that the conflict in Ukraine stops, or at least reaches some kind of fragile ceasefire, it'll take Russia about 5 to 7 to 9 years to reconstitute its forces to the point where it can pose a credible military threat to NATO's eastern flank again. Earlier this month, Germany's leading foreign and security policy think tank, the German Council on Foreign Relations, published a report saying basically we need to get our backsides into gear because Russia will be capable of launching an offensive against NATO's eastern flank within 6 to 10 years. And when the head of Poland's National Security Bureau, Jacek Siewiera, was asked about this, he said that he thought that was, if anything, too optimistic. And if you look at how the Russian mobilization machine has been fired up in Ukraine, and if you look at how its military industrial base is now running is now running at much more of its capacity than Europe's, then he believes that it should be possible for Russia to reach that threshold in as little as 3 years.
Yeah, I know Russia increasing their military spending by 70% next year, so I suppose that's the context for this. Question is, Oliver, do you really think the Russians still believe they can take some of these eastern NATO countries, particularly given NATO strength and given their experience so far in the war in Ukraine?
Well, in terms of NATO's ability to defend the eastern flank, there have been some very positive developments over the past 2 years. Most notably, Finland and Sweden joining, but also Germany promising to put a full brigade in Lithuania, Canada promising to put a sort of slightly lightly staffed brigade in Latvia, Britain saying that it will hold the balance of our brigade in high readiness to support its battle group in Estonia. There's been a lot of military infrastructure and troops moved into Poland. Poland is massively expanding its military to the point where it anticipates it will have more tanks than Germany, France, and Britain put together. On the downside of the equation, chatting to generals and other military analysts over the past few weeks, it's become quite clear to me that there are very serious reservations within NATO about its ability to get enough troops and kit to the front line in time to withstand a Russian attack. And primarily that is a question of ammunition. We're just struggling to make enough of it. And it's a question of logistics because you have got to move more than 100,000 troops across Germany, across Poland, into the Baltic states in that scenario. And that requires an unbelievable amount of coordination and transportation and also security. If you think about the prospect of Russian missile strikes deep behind NATO lines in the way that we've seen them do in Ukraine, and so there are a lot of open questions about whether we're really ready for this scenario.
But I mean, that's quite striking when you think about it, because when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started at the beginning of last year, there was a sort of expectation among many analysts, and indeed this is what the Russians are expecting, they would advance on Kyiv quite easily. Now, obviously that didn't happen. Ukraine aspires to be a NATO member. It isn't, but it's receiving support from NATO allies. If Russia were to attack, let's say, one of the Baltic states, a NATO member, and NATO troops were to be fighting the Russians, surely NATO would hold the upper hand there.
Well, in numerical terms, the jury's still out on whether that would be the case. As I said a moment ago, it all depends on how quickly NATO can mobilize its resources and get them to the front line. The Baltic states themselves have invested massively in their own militaries, but they are small countries, and the numbers of international NATO troops stationed there are at present between 1,000 and 1,400 in each country. And if you think about the kind of numbers that Russia has been able to deploy to Ukraine, it's very possible that the odds could be very difficult for NATO. It all depends on the logistics there, basically.
I suppose it also depends on what happens with the next US presidential election. I mean, Donald Trump has made noises in the past about withdrawing from NATO. Certainly, he doesn't sound particularly supportive of the war effort in Ukraine. Do you think that the Russians are hoping that you'll have a NATO in future without the Americans?
I think that is very much the calculation, and certainly in the countries that I write about, which is Germany and Northern and Central Europe, there has been for some time, and increasingly now, enormous levels of concern about what happens if Trump comes in and doesn't even necessarily withdraw the US from NATO, because that would be quite a difficult thing for him to do without obtaining congressional approval, but says enough to undermine our confidence and Russia's belief in the crucial Article 5 of NATO's founding treaty, the Mutual Defence Clause, the idea that an attack on a small state like Estonia would be considered an attack on the world's most powerful military, the US. And if there is any significant doubt that a USA under a President Trump would not come to the support of its European allies in that scenario, it's very hard to see how the other big European countries in NATO would step up and fill that vacuum of leadership to ensure that Article 5 remains credible.
Let's say there isn't Trump in the White House, but Article 5 still gets triggered because there's an invasion of a NATO country. How would that work in practice? How quickly would you see troops on the ground? And do you think it would work as speedily as it implies it would?
So there are a series of different lines of defense that we've got The first of which, as I mentioned earlier, is the armed forces of Poland, the Baltic states themselves, plus the relatively light NATO multinational battle groups that are on the ground. One would assume that, given the strength of their navies and their logistics, Finland, and if Sweden is in the alliance by that point, also Sweden would be able to deploy to the theatre relatively quickly. The next line is the various high readiness forces that NATO has, including the VJTF, or the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, which Britain is due to take over in the new year. Those are supposed to be able to deploy to a theatre of combat with 10 days' notice. And then beyond that, it's really anyone's guess, because what you're primarily talking about is getting very large numbers of US armed forces personnel and their equipment over to Germany, and then once they're in Germany, getting them over that potentially up to 1,000-mile journey to the front line. And there, from the conversations that I've had, I see the kind of greatest difficulties and the most doubt. I should say NATO, Germany, the other European armed forces involved are putting a lot of work and a lot of thought into this, but there is concern about whether they're getting the political support that they need, and above all, whether they've got the military industrial capacity to replenish these stocks of equipment and ammunition that have been very badly run down over the past 30 years since the end of the Cold War.
I suppose the elephant in the room, Oliver, is what happens with the ongoing war in Ukraine. And were Putin to be defeated there, were he seen to be defeated, do you still think these warnings would apply?
That has absolutely been the argument that Poland and the Baltic states have been making since the very beginning of this conflict, that when we declare our support for Ukraine, yes, there is a moral component to it and a component to upholding the international order, but fundamentally, the clinching argument is that it's in our security interests, because Europe will not be safe until Russia is either incapable or unwilling to pursue aggressive designs on its neighbours in the future. And the most direct path that they see to that outcome is a Russian military defeat in Ukraine. And that is why they have been saying for the past, 22 months now, that we in Europe should give everything we absolutely can to the Ukrainian armed forces in order to try and ensure that they do recover their territory, because that is, in the long run, the cheapest and the easiest and the least bloody way of protecting ourselves against Russia that we've got available.
Given that, are these warnings being heeded much in the capitals of Europe, in particular Berlin? I mean, the EU is missing its target to provide Ukraine with 1 million shells a year. We've got the situation at the moment with an impasse in the US Congress over increased military funding for Ukraine. Are these warnings going to be heeded in Berlin?
Yes and no. The defense ministry under Boris Pistorius is very acutely conscious of the situation, and they are lobbying the government for more funding. There is a sense of momentum and urgency there. The broader problem, as far as Germany is concerned, is that the government is firefighting on all fronts. It's caught in the middle of a budgetary crisis. It has to deal with significant public anxiety about immigration, about a stagnating economy, about finding itself in a fiscal straitjacket. And so there is a shortage of financial and political capital to go into really supercharging this stuff, at least from Berlin's perspective.
What about public support for Ukraine in Germany? Is that still at a high level?
The latest surveys suggest that a strong plurality or a narrow majority of German public opinion supports continuing to deliver heavy weaponry to Ukraine. One thing that we've seen very consistently with the polling on these issues in Germany is that the public is very responsive to political leadership. So while they might feel skeptical about some steps beforehand, once the government has decided it's going to scale up its support for Ukraine, usually the public follows, and you see the support consolidate in the aftermath of that decision, which then obviously makes it a question of leadership from the Chancellery about whether they want to go out on a limb and try and take the public with them instead of being worried about these emerging anxieties in public opinion.
And is there cross-party consensus in terms of supporting Ukraine still in Germany?
There is cross-party consensus in terms of the mainstream parties. So you've got 6 big parties in the Bundestag. 3 of them are in the government. The largest opposition party, the Christian Democratic Union and its Bavarian affiliate, are, if anything, more demonstrative in support of Ukraine than the ruling coalition parties have been. But you do also have a lot more skepticism and even kind of flirtations with a pro-Russia line from the other 2 parties, the left and the Alternative for Germany.
And then what about Poland? I mean, you mentioned, Oliver, that they have massively increased their military spending, but we know in the last 6 months or so, tensions between Kyiv and Warsaw have become a bit more tense. There's been a change in government now, or there's about to be, I believe, in Poland. Any improvement in relations there?
I would be surprised personally, because the reason why we're starting to see these frictions is that really there is a fundamental tension between what Poland sees here as its security interests, where a Ukrainian victory would very much contribute to keeping Poland safe, and its economic interests, where Poles look over the border and see a vast reservoir of cheap agricultural products, cheap factories, cheap labour, cheap lorry drivers that are threatening to compete under increasingly favourable conditions with the corresponding Polish sectors. And so it's become quite a divided political climate in Poland, where on the one side, there is strong cross-party consensus that Ukraine needs to be supported on the military front. But on the economic front, you're starting to see the relationship fraying increasingly with the current blockades by Polish truck drivers on the Ukrainian border.
Do you think these warnings will have any impact on Ukraine's potential future membership of NATO?
One thing I have been told, and this is secondhand, so I attached that caveat to it, is that NATO headquarters is increasingly pessimistic about the battlefield situation in Ukraine. And as a result, this proposal drawn up by the former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen and President Zelensky's Chief of Staff, Andriy Yermak, under which Ukraine, or the bits of Ukraine that are unoccupied, would join NATO in the event of a sort of durable armistice, is now getting a lot more airtime. I don't think there's any unified position on that within NATO. We saw at the Vilnius summit earlier this year that there's quite a broad spectrum of feeling about this, and notably and decisively, the US and Germany are very skeptical of offering Ukraine a quick path into NATO. So it is evolving, but I think those debates are now starting to be had with greater intensity.
How would Poland view Ukraine's membership? Presumably they'd be in favour because it would give them a buffer between them and Russia.
Yeah, I think on balance that is the right analysis. The downside is that the NATO multinational forces that are now being moved to Poland and the Baltic states would, at least in part, have to be diverted to Ukraine. So it's a greater strain on NATO's overall military resources. It makes planning very complicated. NATO's just concluded its first set of 3 detailed regional defence plans since the Cold War. Those would then have to be completely revised in order to take account of this massive new line of conflict with Russia. But I think Poland probably has more issues, strangely enough, with Ukraine's accession to the European Union than it does with Ukraine's accession to NATO.
And when we talk about Russian aspirations to take the eastern flank of the NATO countries, are we talking about Putin, or are we talking about Russia more broadly? Because who knows what the leadership in the Kremlin will look like in 10 years' time?
Yeah, that's an excellent and absolutely central question, and I don't have a definitive answer to it. What I would say is that when Russia experts are trying to analyze the political currents in Moscow, there is a fair amount that rides on their analysis of Putin's psychology and his own preferences, but there is an awful lot of extrapolation from Russian history, and because Putin himself draws on Russian history so often in his rhetoric, including his justification for the war in Ukraine, I think it is instructive and useful to look back on how Russia has viewed the region in the past, all the way back to the Great Northern War in the early 18th century when Peter the Great took what is now the Baltic states from Sweden. And the conclusion there is that Russia has always regarded the Baltic states as part of its natural buffer zone against potential aggression or threats from the West. And throughout the 20th century, um, occupied them from 1940 and then again from 1944 as the Soviet Union. And then even after their independence, continued really to regard them as being part of its sphere of influence. So you can see very long traditions of Russian strategic thinking that are still present in Putin's rhetoric today. And certainly from the perspective of the countries that are in the crosshairs there, they very much doubt that those patterns are going to go away anytime soon.
That's really interesting. I suppose that tallies with the fact that some of the critics that we hear of Putin within Russia actually come from the ultra-nationalist right, as opposed to from a liberal tradition. I mean, Yevgeny Prigozhin, of course, who staged that mutiny with the Wagner Group. You know, he was critical of Putin and the Russian military because he felt they weren't executing the war in Ukraine well enough. So even without Putin, we may get a more nationalistic figure with designs on parts of Eastern and Central Europe.
Yeah, I mean, if you were going to be provocative about it, you could draw a comparison with some of the plots within the Wehrmacht against Hitler during the Second World War, where it wasn't that the conspirators necessarily objected to Hitler's war aims. It's just they thought he was doing a very bad job of running the show. And similarly, in Russia, you basically have two sources of opposition. You have the people who feel that the Putin regime is not doing a good enough job of prosecuting the war in Ukraine. And then you have the kind of what we classify as the Russian opposition. Again, though, they don't necessarily have their interests aligned with Europe's interests. And in fact, we've seen quite a bit of conflict between the Baltic states and elements of the Russian opposition that have wound up there in exile, precisely because the Russian opposition doesn't necessarily see geopolitics in the way that we do.
Can Russia afford to stage this kind of campaign if it wanted to, even if it spent 10 years rearming and boosting its military capacity? We look at the state of the Russian economy. Can it really afford further war in Europe?
So I have to really emphasize I am not a Russia expert and I'm not an economics expert. So all I can go on is what I've heard from analysts at this end of the issue. Um, and basically, there are only two insights I can give. The first is I heard from a very senior intelligence source that Russia's foreign currency reserves are being depleted at a fairly rapid rate, and that sooner or later it is going to run out of fiscal resources and have to retrench in some way or another. Although opinions on that matter do differ a bit between other analysts. The second is that so much of Russia's revenues are dependent on exports of hydrocarbons, and in particular, they're dependent on oil exports, which means Russia is extremely vulnerable to shifts in global oil prices and also the countries that it can get large amounts of its oil to. So it's very important to watch how things evolve with the Chinese economy and with India in particular.
Just finally, Oliver, how much credibility would you give these warnings, and how much credibility do you think people in European capitals, particularly in Berlin, are giving them?
I don't think we should be scared. I think we have an amount of time after the conflict in Ukraine reaches whatever temporary conclusion it reaches And there is a growing consciousness that we need to use that time and make it count. And the view in the military circles that I've consulted about this is that we're not there yet, but we're getting there. And that, in fact, these warnings are helpful because they give us a greater sense of political urgency and a greater consciousness of what needs to be done. If you speak to people in the Baltic states, they're not frightened about coming under attack imminently. They have very strong confidence in Article 5, although that may be a little bit shaken by the prospect of a Trump presidency in the US. But psychologically, it's very difficult for them to live with this constant idea that you could be under military attack at a sort of, anything from a week to several years' notice. So I wouldn't catastrophize about it, but I would say that this is a moment when people are thinking very, very seriously about what happens next, where we go, and how we establish deterrence in order to make sure that we don't have to contemplate any of this in reality.
Oliver, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us on Frontline.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.